Aschenputtel description. When Aschenputtel's mother dies, her father marries a woman with 2 daughters of her own. They treat her like a servant and she's left to sleep on the hearth amongst the ashes, her only friend a little bird that nests in the hazel tree which grew at her mother's grave. When the king throws a feast to find his son a bride, Aschenputtel begs to attend. Her family answers her with taunts and impossible tasks. She's determined to complete them so she can attend. Aschenputtel. Aschenputtel knelt in front of her mother's grave where she was buried in the garden, pressing a hazel twig into the dirt. Tears ran down her face, splashed onto her hands and dampened the earth around the twig. She closed her eyes. It hadn't meant anything to him. She'd felt certain when she'd asked Claude, her father, for the first twig that brushed against his hat after he turned for home, he would remember his first wife. She'd always asked him to bring her that first twig. When he'd returned from the fair with the gifts they'd all asked for, the twig had seemed to mean no more to him than the fine clothes, pearls and diamonds her stepsisters had demanded. "I miss you." Her words were a whisper, dragged from her even though she knew her stepsisters would torment her if they heard. Was her mother watching over her like she'd promised? If she was, how could she let that woman, her father had married, treat her the way she did? Like a servant she was to fetch the water, light the fire, cook the meals and wash the clothes. She was not a servant. Her hands curled into fists. Yet when she complained, her father told her to behave and mind her manners and listen to her mother. That woman wasn't her mother. No, her mother lay buried and not even a year had passed before she'd been replaced. She reached out and pressed the dirt more firmly around the twig. She hadn't forgotten. Not one single thing. The image came clearly to her mind. Her mother smiling, kissing her husband goodbye and telling him to bring her the first twig that brushed against his hat after he turned for home. She'd expected something when she'd asked for the twig. Anything. But his expression had remained the same. Not even a hint of remembrance had clouded his gaze. Aschenputtel. She was tempted to ignore Jean, her stepmother, who stood at the back door. But that was never a good idea. The chores would be piled upon her until she had so much to do that even sleep would be denied her that night. Rising wearily to her feet, she walked towards the house. "Do you hear me, you lazy girl? Get inside and start the evening meal. Must I do everything around here?" Aschenputtel bit back the words she wanted to say. The only thing her stepmother seemed to do around here was order her about. Shoulders slumping, she made her way to the kitchen and began to prepare the meal. Life had been so different when her mother had been alive. Once the meal was over, she'd eaten the scraps her stepmother allowed her and cleaned up the kitchen. She curled up on the hearth amongst the ashes, thinking of the bedroom she'd once slept in. There'd been a large timber bed with a soft feather mattress, crisp linen sheets and warm blankets. One of her stepsisters had it now. Justine, the oldest one. Yvonne had what had once been a guest room. It seemed an age ago. Back when she'd had another name, not one given to torment her. She shouldn't think about those years, should try and accept the way things were now. But it was impossible. Maybe if she hadn't known any different, she wouldn't yearn for all she'd lost. Still thinking about what life had been like when her mother had been alive, she fell asleep. The days seemed to blend, each feeling the same as the previous. She found herself working from dawn to late at night, escaping to her mother's grave several times a day. She tried not to, but tears flowed as she thought of how her family treated her. The hurtful words, the nasty pranks, the constant demands. As the months passed, the twig grew into a tree, watered by her bitter tears and the wish that her mother still lived. One day, not long after her 18th birthday, Aschenputtel ran from the house, the sound of her stepsister's laughter ringing out behind her. She threw herself at the base of the hazel tree that had grown at her mother's grave. What had she done to make them torment her like this? The tears she refused to let fall in front of them poured down her cheeks. A small bird flew out of the tree to land in front of her. "What can I do to help you?" Aschenputtel stared at the bird, trying to stop crying. "You can speak." The bird fluttered closer, jumping across the ground. "Of course I can. Now tell me, what can I do to help?" She looked from the bird to the tree. "Where did you come from?" "I have a nest in the tree." He turned his head in the direction of the hazel tree. Aschenputtel couldn't see the nest, but the leafy tree could have easily hidden a dozen nests amongst its branches. "How can you help me?" She was afraid no one could help. "What do you want?" Her gaze was drawn to the grave. The one thing she most wanted, she couldn't have. Her stomach rumbled, reminding her she hadn't been given food today. Jean had told her she didn't deserve anything with how lazy she'd been yesterday. She'd forgotten one thing from more than a dozen tasks she'd been set. It wasn't fair that she'd been punished over something so small. Not after the hours she'd worked. Something to eat. Without answering, the bird flew off. Aschenputtel watched it go, not expecting to see it again. The day had nearly ended when the little bird returned, flying into the kitchen as she put away the dishes she'd washed. It landed on the table, placing berries on the scrubbed timber. "Is there anything else I can do for you?" She picked up the berries, popping one of them into her mouth. The sweet flavor had her wanting to cram them all in at once. It had been a long time since she'd tasted anything so delicious. "Thank you. These are wonderful." The kindness of the bird brought tears to her eyes. "Would you like more berries?" She nodded, her mouth full. Before she had a chance to speak, the bird took flight, leaving through the open window. She crossed the room and looked into the night, unable to see the little bird. Aschenputtel remained there as she ate the last of the berries. The house was quiet around her, the fire had nearly died out in the hearth, and she felt exhausted after a day of being at Jean's beck and call. But for once, she didn't feel alone. She tried to remember the last time she'd had this feeling. It didn't take her long to figure it out. The last time had been before she'd lost her mother. With one last look for the bird, she turned away from the window and headed for the hearth, where she curled up and fell asleep, her lips curving into a smile, the taste of berries a comforting memory. Over the next few months, the little bird brought Aschenputtel gifts. It regularly brought berries, nuts, seeds and flowers. Once it even brought a silk ribbon, dropping it into her hand as she sat under the hazel tree. She hid it in the tree, not wanting one of her stepsisters to steal it. The many gifts and the company of the bird made life far more bearable, and she sometimes found herself humming and smiling as she worked. It was while she was cleaning out the fireplace in the parlor, trying not to hum since Jean was sitting nearby reading, that she couldn't help wondering that she even remembered how to smile. She had very little to smile about, other than her feathered friend. Her stepsisters burst into the room, dragging her from her thoughts. Their colorful gowns made her think of flowers and sunshine, the scent of their perfumes as dainty and delicate as the two blue-eyed brown-haired girls. How she wished she could have visited their friends with them. Wished that they didn't torment her and treat her like a servant. "We heard the most delightful news," Yvonne said. Justine turned on her sister with a glare. "I'm telling her." She faced her mother. "King Perceval is holding a feast that will last for 3 nights. Everyone is invited. Oh, if only we'd learned about it earlier. We have nothing new to wear." Yvonne stepped past her sister. "You haven't heard the best part yet. It's for his son, Prince Lucien. The king has decided it's time for him to take a bride." Jean rose to her feet, letting the book close as she tossed it onto the chair. She smiled fondly at her daughters. "We must hurry. The prince is sure to want to marry one of you. No other lady hereabouts can hold a candle to your beauty." Aschenputtel, still crouched in front of the fireplace, didn't doubt Jean's words. Her stepsisters were beautiful and had numerous suitors. The prince would be caught by their looks too. If only she could go. She stared at her hands, ash-coating them. Who would let a dirty, poorly dressed girl attend a ball? Her heart sank as she watched her stepmother and stepsisters discuss what would be the best outfit for each of them. She wanted to escape to the garden, but hoped if she remained quiet and still they would ignore her. "Aschenputtel! What are you doing, you lazy girl?" Jean brushed past her daughters to glare at Aschenputtel. "Go and clean the shoes. Hurry. We're running out of time." She spun on her heel and strode from the room, her daughters following her. After Aschenputtel had cleaned the shoes and ran around completing the many tasks demanded of her, she couldn't resist asking Jean to let her go too. Jean stared at her a moment before bursting out laughing. "You, dressed as you are? You have nothing to wear and can't even dance. Why would you even want to go to the feast? You should thank me for saving you from the mockery of the guests." Aschenputtel reached for Jean, but the woman stepped away, a look of disgust for the dirty hand stretched towards her. "Please? I don't need to dance, or even join in the feast. No one would have to know I was there. Please let me go." She couldn't stop pleading, no matter how much her stepsisters and Jean mocked her. This was her only chance to visit the castle. The king had one child, so it wasn't likely he'd ever invite everyone to the castle for a feast again. Eventually Jean said, "You want to go to the feast?" Aschenputtel nodded, hope starting to fill her. She clasped her hands in front of her to prevent herself from reaching for Jean again. "Follow me." Jean strode to the kitchen, everyone trailing after her. Reaching the kitchen, she took a dish full of peas and tossed them into the ash heap. "If you can pick them out within 2 hours, you may join us." Aschenputtel stared at the scattered peas while her stepsisters laughed. The hope she'd felt died. "Come girls. We need to finish getting ready." Jean swept from the room. Fighting back tears, Aschenputtel raced outside to the hazel tree. Seeing it reminded her of her friend, the little bird. Maybe he and his friends could help her pick the peas from the ash. She called out to them. Turtle doves, linnets, blackbirds, thrushes and chaffinches. They came to her, following her to the kitchen and picking the peas from the ash and dropping them into the dish. It took them less than an hour, and they flew out the window the moment the job was complete. Smiling, she gathered up the dish and went in search of Jean. She found her helping Justine finish dressing. Her smile faded when she saw her stepsister. The prince would want to dance all night with Justine. Aschenputtel had never seen her stepsister look so beautiful. She caught sight of herself in the mirror Justine stood near. She almost didn't recognize herself. Once light brown hair with golden streaks was now the color of the ashes from the fireplace. The rest of her was equally as dirty, including her drab gray dress. The tears nearly welled up again. Forcing them down, she took another step into the room, holding out the peas, forcing herself to speak the name she always stumbled over. "Mother, I gathered the peas as you requested." Jean gave her one of her usual looks of disgust. "You couldn't have. Somehow you must have cheated." "No." Aschenputtel held the dish out further. "Look. These are the peas you threw in the hearth. They've all been collected." Jean snatched the dish from her and strode to the kitchen, where she took a second dish of peas. She threw both lots of peas into the ashes. "If you pick all the peas from the ashes in 1 hour, you can go to the feast too." Aschenputtel gaped as she watched Jean leave the dishes on the table and stride from the room, calling Justine to follow. Justine remained in the doorway a moment longer, smirking. "How dare you even think you can attend the feast? Did you expect us to let you in the carriage with us? Father wouldn't want someone as dirty as you in our carriage." With a look of disgust, similar to the one her mother used, Justine left the kitchen. Aschenputtel stared at the empty doorway. It had taken the birds nearly an hour to pick one dish of peas from the ashes. How could they pick 2 from them in the same amount of time? Weariness tugged at her. It would be far easier to curl up on the hearth and sleep, rather than trying to find a way to attend the feast. She looked from the hearth to the door leading to the garden. Deciding to give it one more try, she walked to the hazel tree and called the birds like she had before. The sun had set and she feared that none would answer her call. They came, nearly twice as many as before, and picked the peas from the ashes. They were done in half an hour, and Aschenputtel gathered the 2 dishes, hurrying through the house looking for Jean. This time she found her helping Yvonne to finish getting ready. Aschenputtel held out the 2 dishes. "I gathered all the peas as you requested, Mother." She stumbled on the last word. "Look at yourself." Jean gestured towards her. "Would you go to the feast dressed like that?" Aschenputtel looked down at herself. "I thought maybe I could borrow something from Justine or Yvonne." Her words were hesitant. "You're not borrowing anything from me," Yvonne said. "I would have to burn it afterwards." Jean turned to Yvonne. "Fetch your sister. Your father will be back with the carriage at any moment. We don't want to be late." When Yvonne walked past her, keeping her skirts well away, Aschenputtel wanted to argue that he wasn't her stepsister's father. He was hers. But he hadn't really been hers since he'd remarried and acted like his first marriage hadn't existed, including the child born of it. Jean crossed the room, pausing in the doorway to send her a look of disgust. Did you really think we'd let you shame us by attending the feast? You must be stupid as well as lazy. She sailed from the room, head high, mocking laughter trailing behind her. Aschenputtel nearly dropped the dishes of peas. All that kept her from letting go was the thought of having to clean them up later. Hearing the carriage pull up, she left the dishes in the kitchen before running to the parlor window. Outside, her father helped her stepsisters and Jean into the carriage lanterns clearly showing the fond smile he gave his wife. Pain arrowed through Aschenputtel, and she wanted to run out there and demand he take her too. Demand he not forget she existed. It was too late. He was already climbing into the carriage, and the coachman was driving off into the night. The house was empty and she was alone again. She ran to the hazel tree, tears streaming down her face, the light of the nearly full moon lighting her way. For once they weren't tears of sorrow. Anger coursed through her and she called out, "I wanted to go too." She repeated the words, quieter this time. "I wanted to go to the feast too." The little bird flew out of the tree. "How can I help you? I have nothing to wear. How can I attend the feast without a ball gown?" She thought of the dresses her stepsisters had worn, wanting one that would outshine them. A dress of silver and gold. One that no one would recognize me in. She sighed, knowing she asked for the impossible. "I'm sorry. You must be tired of hearing all my complaints." Without answering, the bird flew into the tree, and Aschenputtel stared at the shadowy leaves he'd disappeared into. She guessed he was. Before she could rise to her feet and return inside, the bird flew out of the tree with a silver and gold dress and slippers of spangled silk. Aschenputtel was afraid to touch them, worried she might soil them with her dirt. She gingerly carried them inside and washed the dirt from her body, before donning the clothes and dressing her hair. Standing in front of Justine's mirror, she once again barely recognized herself. The young woman reflected in the mirror was nothing like her usual self. Not a single person would recognize her. A smile slowly formed. Not even her father. She raced through the house, hurrying through the streets to the castle, not wanting to miss too much of the feast. When she arrived, she was ushered inside and treated like royalty. Her smile grew wider when she heard some of the whispers as people speculated over who she was. Her favorite was that she must be a foreign princess. The evening felt like a dream. The dress she wore was so much more than she'd ever owned, and the food was delicious. She ate far less than what she would have liked for fear she'd be sick from the rich food. People smiled at her and spoke politely, treating her like she was someone important. She didn't want the evening to ever end. Didn't want to return to a life of drudgery and servitude. When Prince Lucien came towards her, smiling, she nearly forgot to breathe. His black hair was neatly styled, his brown eyes stared straight at her rather than through her like she was accustomed to, and his clothes were trimmed with gold. She dropped into a curtsy as he stopped in front of her. "Your Royal Highness." She was amazed her voice was steady when inside she quaked with terror that she might say or do something that would show him she was only a kitchen wench. Lucien bowed to her, holding out his hand. "Will you do me the honor of dancing with me?" Worried she would stumble and make a fool of herself, Aschenputtel took the hand he held out. "Could we take a walk in the gardens first? I've been told they're magnificent." "Certainly." They wandered through the gardens, which were lit by colored lanterns. At first Aschenputtel was nervous, uncertain how to answer Lucien's many questions. Eventually, she began to ask him questions of her own. The hours passed far too quickly, and somehow she found herself agreeing to dance with him, and they returned inside. She didn't stumble once. The lessons she'd had while her mother had been alive slowly came back to her. When the dance ended, a gentleman stopped at her side and bowed. She dropped into a curtsy, not as deep as the one she'd offered Lucien. "Would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" Still holding on to Lucien's arm, she tried to think of a way to politely decline. "The lady is dancing with me," Lucien said. The gentleman bowed towards Lucien. "Of course, Your Royal Highness." Aschenputtel smiled up at Lucien as they began to dance again. The night was like a dream. She'd never expected the prince to want to dance with her. Nor had she thought she'd have the chance to wander the gardens with him, talking half the night. All she'd originally hoped for was to be able to see the castle and the beautifully dressed people. To have a glimpse into their lives that were far removed from her own. When some of the guests began to leave, Aschenputtel thought it best to go too. She didn't want her family to arrive home and find her gone. When the current dance ended, she drew away from Lucien. "I must leave. Thank you for such a wonderful evening." She spun from him, not wanting Lucien to see the tears gathering in her eyes. "Wait," Lucien called out. She didn't stop. Hurrying through the guests, she fled the ballroom. The last thing she wanted to do was burst into tears in front of all these people. The evening was over and she had to return to her life. There was no way the prince, or anyone for that matter, would be interested in her if they knew the truth. She reached the stairs outside the castle and stumbled, her slippers making it difficult to run. "Wait! Please wait! I never even asked your name." Ignoring Lucien's pleas, she ran into the night. He continued to follow her, and not wanting him to know where she lived, she jumped up into the pigeon house at the back of her father's garden, begging the birds to help her escape. She went out the other side of the pigeon house, and fled to the hazel tree, where she returned her finery to the little bird. Dressing in her dirty gown and messing up her hair, she coated her skin with the ashes from the hearth. Peeking out the back door, she could see the prince at the pigeon house looking for her. Shoulders slumping, she turned away and slowly walked to the hearth where she curled up. How was she ever going to endure her days now? She hadn't thought about that. An evening spent being treated like a princess made her crave an escape. But she had no idea how to escape from her father's home. Where could she go? How would she live? The sound of her family arriving home brought her thoughts to an end. She closed her eyes, pretending she was fast asleep. It didn't take long for pretending to become reality, and she fell asleep, to dream about dancing with Lucien. Her dreams were interrupted by Jean's voice. "You lazy girl, wake up. How dare you sleep half the day away? You think we should feed you when you can't even help around here?" Aschenputtel staggered to her feet, surprised to find Jean was right. She'd slept the morning away. "I'm sorry." She ducked her head as she scurried away to make the morning meal. By evening, she was ready to throw something at her stepsisters. Or at least tell them she'd been at the feast too. They'd spent the entire day telling her about all she'd supposedly missed out on, and the mysterious princess Lucien had spent most of the evening with. When they finally left for the second night of the feast, Aschenputtel made her way to the hazel tree, anger burning through her. She would have one more night of being treated like a princess. Just one more night. Then she'd be able to return to her normal life. Like the previous night, she asked the little bird to bring her clothes of silver and gold. He flew down out of the tree with a gown more magnificent than the previous one. As soon as she was washed and dressed, she hurried through the streets to the castle. Lucien waited for her, taking her hand the moment she stepped into the ballroom. "Will you take a walk in the gardens with me?" "I'd be honored, Your Royal Highness." She took the hand he offered her and walked beside him. "Please call me Lucien." She inclined her head. "You never told me your name." She couldn't give it to him, not without him learning who she was. There was no way she wanted him to learn she was a dirty, unwanted girl, who slept in the ashes of the hearth at her father's home. She smiled up at him, thinking of the tree the little bird lived in. Hazel. They spent the night talking and dancing, and when they joined the rest of the guests for the meal, Lucien asked her to sit at his side. It was as much of a dream as the previous night, and she didn't want it to end. Every time a gentleman asked her to dance with him, Lucien would tell them she was dancing with him, and the second time he said it, she smiled up at him. "You don't mind?" She continued to smile at him. "No, not at all." The night passed far too quickly, and when guests started to leave, Aschenputtel drew away from Lucien. "I have to return home." "Stay." She shook her head. "No, I'm sorry, I must leave." She couldn't let her family arrive home before her and find her missing. "Let me take you home in my carriage." She started to argue, then thought it might be a way to slip away from him rather than have him chase her through the streets like the previous night. "I'll wait out the front." As soon as she was out of Lucien's sight, she ran to the stairs and hurried down them. She was nearly home before she heard Lucien behind her, calling for her to wait. She sprang up into a large pear tree not far from the pigeon house, slipping out the other side of it, and hurrying to the hazel tree where she returned the finery to the little bird. By the time her family arrived home, she was once again in her dirty dress and covered in ash, curled up on the hearth and pretending to be asleep. She was starting to congratulate herself on her narrow escape when she heard Lucien's voice in the hallway. It took all her willpower not to run out and see what he was doing. She crept to the kitchen doorway so she could hear him more clearly. "The lady I spent the night dancing with disappeared into the pear tree in your garden. Would you happen to know who she might be?" "No, but let me fetch my axe and chop down the tree so we can all find out who she is," Claude said. Aschenputtel hurried back to the hearth and curled up, half closing her eyes. She watched as her father and Lucien came through the kitchen, Jean, Justine and Yvonne trailing behind them. The two girls clutched at each other, giggling and whispering. Aschenputtel was glad Lucien didn't even spare them a glance. Once they'd all trooped outside, she dashed across the room to peer out the door. Claude swung his axe at the pear tree as everyone watched. When it came crashing to the ground, he helped Lucien look amongst the branches. Aschenputtel was tempted to call out to Lucien when she saw the dejected slump of his shoulders as he bid them good night, and walked away alone. Only the thought of what he'd think of her, dressed in her filthy gown and looking nothing like the glamorous woman he sought, kept her quiet. Seeing her family were returning to the house, she crept back to her place at the hearth. When her stepsisters left the room, sent to bed by Jean, Aschenputtel was tempted to open her eyes to see why her parents remained in the kitchen. "Who do you think she is?" Jean asked. "I have no idea. For a moment I thought it might be my daughter, but that was a stupid notion," Claude said. Jean laughed. "That dirty, lazy girl? You foolish man, whatever could you have been thinking?" Claude remained silent, and Aschenputtel again fought the urge to open her eyes. "I'm going to bed. We have a lot to do when we wake. Yesterday I had the girls' measurements sent to the dressmaker. They'll outshine that mysterious lady and catch the prince's attention. It's their last chance to make an impression." Aschenputtel heard Jean's footsteps leave the room. She didn't hear Claude move. When she was about to finally open her eyes, she heard his footsteps. They brought him closer rather than further away. He stood in front of her and she couldn't help it. She opened her eyes to stare up at his shadowy figure. No one had lit the candle that had been left on the table, and she hoped he couldn't see she was awake. He stood there a moment longer, before turning away and leaving the kitchen. Aschenputtel sat up, staring after him. What had he been thinking as he stood there staring down at her? Had he been remembering his first wife? She didn't know but guessed she'd better get some sleep. It sounded like Jean would be full of orders when she woke and tried to make sure her daughters outshone her. Aschenputtel grinned, wondering what Jean would say if she realized who the mysterious lady was. She'd probably lock her up so she couldn't ruin Justine and Yvonne's chances. Aschenputtel was right. Jean threw orders around all day. By the time her family left for the final night of the feast, Aschenputtel was glad to see the last of them. She wandered out the back to the hazel tree, unable to stop herself from asking the little bird to bring her another gown. One to outshine the previous two. She didn't want Lucien to end up with either of her stepsisters. They might be beautiful and have dozens of suitors, but they were as rotten as a maggot-filled apple. The gown was the most exquisite garment she'd ever seen, and the slippers were all of gold. As soon as she'd washed and dressed, Aschenputtel again hurried to the castle. Lucien met her at the ballroom door, taking her hand and staring down at her. When he remained silent, she dropped into a curtsy. "Your Royal Highness. Your beauty leaves me speechless." He took her hand and led her to the gardens. "Where do you disappear to each night?" "Why, I return home, Your Royal Highness." "I thought we agreed you'd call me Lucien." She smiled. "I return home, Lucien." She emphasized his name, continuing to smile up at him. Tell me about your home." She had no idea what to say. How could she tell him anything about her life? It would probably disgust him. There was only one thing about her life worth talking about. "I have the dearest friend. A sweet little bird who brings me lovely gifts to brighten my days." They wandered through the gardens talking and laughing, eventually joining the guests for the meal. Aschenputtel spent the entire night at Lucien's side, dancing with him after the meal. When a gentleman asked her for a dance, Lucien barely let him get the words out before he spoke. "The lady is my partner, sir." After that, no one else bothered them. The night grew late, and when guests began to leave, Aschenputtel looked around. She couldn't see her family. Fearing they'd arrive home before her, she drew away from Lucien. Her gaze focused on him, her heart aching at the thought of never seeing him again. "I must return home. Let me escort you there." Thinking she could slip away from him again, she nodded. This time he remained at her side, leading her out of the ballroom. She couldn't let him see where she lived, couldn't let him learn she was little more than a kitchen wench. When they reached the stairs, she pulled away from him, running down them. In her haste, she lost one of her slippers. There was no time to stop and collect it. Lucien would catch her. The distance between them grew, and she lost him in the streets before turning for home. Seeing her family's carriage pulling up at the front of the house, she went through the garden, leaving her finery at the foot of the hazel tree for the little bird to deal with. She'd barely dressed, covered herself with ashes, and curled up on the hearth when she heard her family enter the house. Her stepsisters were complaining bitterly about the woman who'd outshone them all. Aschenputtel smiled, relieved Lucien hadn't been caught by either of them. Her smile faded as she wondered who he'd end up marrying. He couldn't remain single forever. His father would insist he choose someone or would make the choice for him. Tears filled her eyes, and she began to think it would have been better not to have met him. Didn't she have enough heartbreak in her life without having gone seeking more? But she hadn't known. She'd only thought to escape her life for a few days, not fall in love with a prince. She was the first to rise the next morning, having been woken by nightmares about Lucien marrying Justine. Unable to sleep further, she went outside and sat at the base of the hazel tree. The little bird flew out and landed on her shoulder. "What can I do for you?" She sighed heavily. "Nothing. Just keep me company." Her friend couldn't bring her what she most wanted. She wondered what Lucien was doing. Had he slept as poorly? Or was he even now choosing who was to be his future bride? Sighing once more, she rose to her feet. She should get on with her chores before Jean woke and started complaining about how lazy she was. Surprisingly, Jean didn't complain about her at all. She ranted all morning about the mysterious lady. Aschenputtel tried not to smile. She supposed Jean actually was complaining about her, even though she didn't realize it. Both her stepsisters joined their mother in her complaints, and Aschenputtel was glad her stepsisters decided to visit one of their friends. They were barely gone an hour when they raced into the house, pushing and shoving to be in the lead. "Mother!" Both of them called out at once. Justine elbowed her sister. "I'm telling her." Yvonne shoved at Justine. "You told her last time." Aschenputtel watched them from the doorway of the parlor she'd been about to enter. Jean rose from her seat, setting aside her needlework. "Enough. Show some decorum. What is so important you should almost come to blows over it?" "The prince is coming," Justine said at the same time as Yvonne said. "Prince Lucien has said he'll marry whoever fits the slipper." "Quiet." Jean turned to Justine. "Start from the beginning and tell me exactly what is going on." Aschenputtel clung to the doorframe, thinking about the slipper she'd left behind. There were probably a number of women who'd fit the slipper. She couldn't be the only woman with small feet. The mysterious lady left behind one of her slippers. King Perceval is livid his son won't choose a bride. It's all over the town that they argued this morning, and Prince Lucien held up the slipper and said he'd only marry the woman who can fit the slipper she left behind. He's been traveling from house to house and the ladies have been trying to squeeze their feet into it, Justine said. "Hurry," Jean waved them from the room. "You must prepare yourselves for your bridegroom. Put on your finest gowns." Aschenputtel stepped out of the doorway, not wanting to be caught listening in on them. "What if we don't fit it?" Yvonne asked. "We'll make it fit." Jean sailed from the room, her daughters following in her wake. Aschenputtel stared after them, thinking about her nightmare. Surely he wouldn't marry one of her stepsisters. She tried to think of something she could do, but there was nothing. Claude came into the hallway. "What's all the fuss about?" Aschenputtel looked around, but there was no one else to answer him. Prince Lucien is searching for his bride." She'd nearly called him by his first name. "He's coming here. To marry one of my daughters?" Aschenputtel shrugged. "I'd better go and see if they need anything." She breathed in sharply as he walked away, unshed tears making her throat ache. Running from the house, she went to the hazel tree, throwing herself on the ground. "Don't let him marry them. Please don't let him marry them." The bird flew out to land on her shoulder. "Their feet will not fit your slipper." She dashed away her tears. "They won't." "No. Your feet are far more dainty than theirs." Relief rushed through her. "Thank you." She put up her hand so the bird could hop onto it. "Thank you, my dearest friend." She dropped a kiss onto his head and lifted her hand so he could fly back to the tree. Taking a calming breath, she wiped the last of the tears from her face and returned to the kitchen. When Lucien arrived and was shown to the parlor, Aschenputtel crept close to catch a glimpse of him. She wanted to run into the room and beg him to let her try on the slipper too. A footman stood beside him, holding the slipper. Lucien waved the footman forward. Jean stepped between the footman and Justine. "Surely you don't expect my daughter to try the slipper on in front of two gentlemen? How undignified." She took the slipper from the footman. "We will be back in a minute." Aschenputtel fled to the kitchen, slipping into a shadowy corner when the three of them entered the room. "How will I ever fit my foot into the slipper?" Justine demanded. "It looks like it belongs to a child." "Sit down. We'll make it fit." Jean gestured to one of the chairs at the kitchen table. Aschenputtel watched as Jean tried to force Justine's foot into the slipper. Relief washed over her when they failed. "My big toe keeps getting in the way," Justine complained. Jean grabbed a knife. "Then we'll get rid of it." Justine jumped to her feet. "No. How can you say something like that?" "Let me try," Yvonne said. "Do you want to marry a prince?" Jean demanded. Justine nodded. "When you eventually become the queen, you won't care about toes. Sit down and let me cut off your big toe. And don't you dare make a sound." Aschenputtel couldn't believe Justine sat down and let her mother cut off her toe. She watched as her stepsister paled but didn't make a sound. Instead she clutched the back of the chair, her knuckles white from her grip. Once the toe was gone, the slipper slid on easily. Jean wiped the blood from the slipper and rose to her feet. "Now let's go and show your bridegroom." Aschenputtel couldn't bring herself to follow them. She sunk to the floor where she stood, drawing her legs up and wrapping her arms around them. Her nightmare was about to come true. Jean had made the slipper fit Justine. She had no idea how long she sat there, but eventually she rose to check in the parlor. Jean and Yvonne were sitting there congratulating themselves, Claude beaming proudly. Aschenputtel went to the front door and peeked outside. She was surprised to see Lucien riding back towards the house, Justine seated sideways before him, an angry expression on her face. The footman rode beside them. What had happened? Aschenputtel didn't know, but she couldn't risk being caught spying at the door. She hurried to the kitchen, waiting until Lucien was ushered inside before she returned to peeking around the edge of the parlor door. Lucien pointed towards Justine. "You tried to trick me by cutting off her toe." Jean shook her head. "Certainly not, Your Royal Highness. Look at her foot. If a little bird hadn't called out to me as I rode away, telling me to look at the foot of my false bride, I would have taken her home." Jean checked Justine's foot. "You deceitful girl. How dare you?" "But—" Justine's words were cut off by a slap from her mother. "Go to your room." Jean turned to Lucien. "I'm terribly sorry, Your Royal Highness. I'll keep a better eye on my younger daughter." At Lucien's nod, she took the slipper from the footman. Aschenputtel, who'd momentarily stepped out of the way to let Justine through, hurried to the kitchen and hid in the shadowy corner again. She watched as Jean seated Yvonne at the table and tried to force the slipper on her. The slipper's too small. Yvonne glared at her heel, which wouldn't fit in. We'll make it fit. Jean took the knife she'd used on her eldest daughter. I'll cut off your heel. Yvonne drew up her foot. It didn't work for Justine. The foolish girl must have given herself away. Whoever heard of a bird talking? He'll see the blood. Not if we bind it. Now quit stalling and give me your foot. Don't you want to be a queen one day? Yvonne lowered her foot to the floor. Of course I do. Aschenputtel watched as her stepsister gasped, her eyes filling with tears. She felt a moment of sympathy for Yvonne, but forced it away with memories of all the nasty things her stepsister had done to her. It's so painful, Yvonne wailed. Oh hush. Do you want them to hear you? Finished, Jean bound the foot and pushed it in the slipper. They're all done. Now don't say a word. Yvonne whimpered, wiping at the tears with the back of one hand. She rose to her feet and walked slowly from the kitchen. Jean followed her. Aschenputtel stepped away from the corner, trying to decide if she should follow. Would Lucien check that the slipper fit properly this time? Crossing the room, she paused in the doorway, listening. Had they already left? She silently made her way to the parlor and peeked around the doorway. Her parents were in there, smiling at each other, talking about how life would change when Yvonne married the prince. Aschenputtel moved away, not wanting to listen to another word. Would her little bird warn Lucien again? She was afraid he wouldn't. But even if the bird warned him, that didn't mean she'd have the chance to try on the slipper. What was she thinking? She was dressed in rags, covered in ash, and looked nothing like the lady Lucien searched for. She'd nearly given up when she heard them returning, Yvonne wailing loudly. She slipped away so no one would see her, watching from the kitchen doorway as Yvonne led Lucien into the parlor. She hurried forward in time to hear Lucien speak. Once again a little bird told me I hadn't found my true bride, and you had tried to deceive me. Aschenputtel saw that this time it was Lucien who held the slipper, and he didn't look happy. She was relieved her friend had saved him from the clutches of her stepsisters. Jean clasped her hands together. Your Royal Highness, I cannot imagine what my foolish girls were thinking. She turned to Yvonne. Go to your room and stay there. Yvonne hobbled from the room, still wailing. Aschenputtel, who'd stepped out of the way, peered back into the room. Have you no other daughters? Lucien asked. Claude shook his head. No, there's only a dirty little kitchen wench, the daughter of my first wife. His words hurt, and she nearly burst into the room to tell him she was his daughter too. Jean's words stopped her. There's no point asking her to present herself. She's so dirty she'd be ashamed to show her face to you, Your Royal Highness. Aschenputtel looked down at herself as she listened to Lucien tell her parents to fetch her. Jean was right. How could she face Lucien looking like this? She never wanted to see that same look of disgust on his face that she regularly saw on Jean's. She ran to the kitchen, planning to retreat to the hazel tree. She stopped in the doorway, unable to bring herself to take another step away from Lucien. Someone was sure to fit the slipper. Lucien would keep looking until he found someone. She couldn't bear to think of Lucien married to anyone else. Turning around, she fetched water and washed her hands and face. It wasn't much of an improvement, but it was all she had time for. She strode back to the parlor, hoping they hadn't left. Jean was the first to notice her. What are you doing here? Ignoring Jean, Aschenputtel crossed the room to stand in front of Lucien, who looked surprised. She dropped into a curtsy, wondering if it was because he recognized her or if he was amazed a dirty kitchen wench had the audacity to present herself to him. When she rose, she reached for the slipper, removing her own clumsy boot before sliding her foot into it. She met Lucien's gaze, relieved to see surprise had been replaced by a smile. Your Royal Highness, I believe the slipper fits. Lucien chuckled. How many times must I ask you to call me Lucien? No. Jean's roar prevented any reply Aschenputtel might have made. Lucien turned to Jean. This one is the right bride. Turning to Aschenputtel, he held out his hand. She willingly took it, and was surprised when he raised her hand to his lips. not to mention relieved she'd taken the time to wash it. He met her gaze over her hand, lowering it as he took a step closer. "Shall we go home?" She nodded, walking beside him to the front of the house where his horse waited. He swung up into the saddle and held his hand out so he could set her before him. She couldn't bring herself to take it, afraid her dirty clothes would ruin his immaculate outfit. "Don't you wish to become my bride?" Concern crossed his face. "After all those hours we spent together talking and dancing, I had thought—" His voice trailed off. Seeing some of her own fears reflected back at her in his expression helped hers disappear. She took his hand and let him help her onto the horse so she could sit sideways in front of him. Turning her face, she met his gaze. "I couldn't think of anything I'd rather do." She returned Lucien's smile, facing forward when the horse began to walk away from the house. The sound of wings drew their attention, and Lucien chuckled when the little bird landed on her shoulder. "I had a feeling it was your friend when he spoke to me earlier." Aschenputtel was glad the little bird was coming with her. She smiled. She'd underestimated her friend that morning when he'd asked her what he could do for her. It looked like he'd helped her after all. "Yes, he's one of my dearest friends and I'm grateful he came into my life." She thought back to the moment she'd asked her father for the twig, trying to remind him of her mother. Instead it had brought her something far more precious than just the little bird. Her gaze met Lucien's and held it. "Without him I would never have met you. Then is one of my dearest friends too."